All right, moving on to Robespierre. I want to introduce Robespierre historically, and then I want to present in general what he has to say. I want to point out the basic points here. Um, so Robespierre, Maximilien Robespierre, was a lawyer, and he became a member of the General Assembly, the Constitutional Assembly, in 1789. And he was not particularly famous beforehand. He quickly became famous. He got a nickname. They called him the Incorruptible. Apparently he was quite a dandy in his dress, very well dressed, very sharp, very well spoken, but otherwise completely uninterested in wealth. We're going to read some about Robespierre's life and his character when we read Hannah Arendt writing about the American and the French Revolution. And I think she has really interesting things to say about him. She points out interesting things about him. What she says primarily is that Robespierre was one dude before he got into power, and maybe he became a different dude when he got into power. This, again, is related to that anarchist. The anarchists think the moment you put anybody into power, they are going to act first and foremost to sustain and to expand that power. They will feel that they deserve to be in the position where they are, and they will act to improve that position, regardless of the things that they said in the past. So this is sort of what happens with Robespierre. The stuff that we're reading was written just as he was moving into power. These are speeches. Basically, the content of the stuff that we're looking at, I think on the one hand, it's a useful critique of foreign war, of a war economy, of a permanent war footing, which is important for us because I would challenge you to find a place in the whole existence of the United States when it was not at war in one way or another. There's that critique, and then there's like the advancement of what I would take to be like a proto-socialist position. This is the argument about bread and grain that I want to make to you. But there's this other dimension that's going on with Robespierre that we'll read about, which is that to begin with, and this is a whole interesting process. To begin with, the French Revolution starts with a constitutional assembly, and they set up voting districts in Paris and across France, particularly in Paris, for the purpose of being able to elect representatives to these assemblies. But this never quite goes through, and instead what happens is that the Paris Commune, as it's so called, so there's the 1791 Paris Commune, and then there's the 1871 Paris Commune, so the same term used for two different historical phenomena in the same city with similar characteristics. What happens is that the so-called Paris Commune, which was broken into, I think it's like 48 parts or something like that, it was just organized in order to elect representatives. Instead of doing that function, the communes became, or the sections of the commune became their own self-governing entities. And at the same time that there were these local, territorially based self-governing councils, there were also so-called popular societies, which were not territorially based, but they were like interest-based. So societies for the sciences, societies for the arts, societies for sports, societies that were militias. This whole thing, by the way, this is like the anarchist model of like what we should do. Each one of these societies was self-governing to some degree, and they became, in the early revolution, sort of the basis of power. Robespierre, referred to as the Incorruptible because he was clearly not out, it seems like maybe he really enjoyed power, but he was not out for money. Early on, before he gets himself into a position of central power, he's a strong proponent of the power of these self-governing assemblies, which of course are multiple, plural, scattered, different in their leanings across Paris and across the entirety of France. So if you have a revolutionary circumstance with all these like local decision-making bodies pushing in different ways, then you basically have this like large-scale democratic pluralism or something. And to begin with, Robespierre thinks that's awesome. That's liberty. The practice of like real political decision-making, real determination of what is going to happen in a neighborhood by the people in that neighborhood. That's the revolution. Hell yeah, that's people power. And by the way, like that's in large part the position I am advocating for. A lot of the stuff that we're going to read suggests that that's a desirable thing. You can refer to a system like that to an extent as a dual power system, because those popular assemblies are starting to back off the power or offset the power of state function. You can call this the council system. You could also call it like, communes in federation, which is basically the way that Kropotkin will talk about what anarchists want. So Robespierre is a revolutionary of this sort to begin with, but he's also affiliated with a political club who are called the Jacobins, and this club was unique. Now, of course, the Assembly gave birth, and Hannah Arendt is really the person to read about this, and it's just about an 8-page thing, which I think clarifies this stuff a lot. The Assembly gave birth to a whole bunch of party factions, which were really different from the collectives on the street, which were either neighborhood assemblies or affinity groups would be the later anarchist term, those popular societies for science and militia and whatever. Inside the assembly, you're already playing around with representative government. This is direct democracy over here. Everybody who's affected votes on what is going to affect them. Over here, we have special people who are supposed to be elected to represent the interests of large numbers of people. And then within a parliamentary situation, of course, in ours, in our two-party system, we have just about the lowest possible amount of real debate. Rousseau had said, the fewer factions there are, the worse your situation is, the less possible it is to generate by vote the general will. In a better parliamentary system, you have multiple parties jockeying for power, and so at least the possibility of a representation of multiple points of view. But it's important, too, that what's happening inside the representative assembly is local, really, to that specific assembly. And so what you have is the development of cliques within the governmental apparatus, totally distinct from the power over here in the neighborhoods and in the popular societies. One of these factions was the Jacobin Club. The Jacobin Club, according to Hannah Arendt, was always a club for representatives. And the Jacobins were arguably the most aggressive and extreme of the political factions. Robespierre was associated with that faction. So as time goes on, the revolution, it hits a tipping point. And this tipping point has a couple of characteristics. One is that there is ultimately the formation of a committee called the Committee on Public Safety, small group of people, and Robespierre is on this committee. And this committee effectively becomes something like the revolutionary government. So instead of like this initial percolating, truly democratic and decentralized production of local power, now we have a centralization of power. And this is what Napoleon is eventually going to inherit. The Jacobins really, they consolidate France. They unify France. They center France upon themselves. And the way that they do it is that the Jacobins infiltrate all of the different sections of the communes, all of the different territorially based assemblies, and all of the popular societies, or at least as many as they could. And once there, they basically evaluated the people in those sections in terms of, they used these frightening terms, their patriotism and their revolutionary spirit. So they were to be judged according to the standards of the Jacobins, and those people who did not match up to the standards of the Jacobins were killed, were executed. And this is the best known feature of the rule of the Committee on Public Safety and the influence of the Jacobins. So for one thing, they're centralizing the whole country. And at this point, when Robespierre gets into power in this way, he no longer supports the power of the societies. He no longer supports the power of the independent communes. He starts saying, look, the only society that we can have is France itself. He becomes a nationalist. He becomes a proponent of unifying the will, unifying the behavior, unifying the beliefs, unifying the strategies and the direction of the entire nation. And they do this by force. What he's best known for is the terror. So the terror refers to a period of maybe 2 years in which tens of thousands of people are executed across France. Now, there are probably really different types of execution that happened in the French Revolution, because the first one would be like when you have local uprisings. So in the city we had the communes. In Paris we had the Paris Commune broken into its 48 sections. In the countryside, there were spontaneous uprisings on the part of peasants, especially when they started to see that some other town had done it, when they started to see that Paris had done it, when they started to see that the king was in prison, when they started to realize that the aristocracy was weakened, that they were ready to be toppled. Localities took it upon themselves spontaneously to rise up, Go destroy the castle of their lord. Be very careful to destroy all the documentation listing who is legally enserfed on this land. So they were liberating themselves. And they executed their rulers. They killed their masters. That's revolution in its bloodiest and probably most direct sense. That's one variety of violence, decentralized violence. Violence carried out by the victims against the people who had victimized them. Bloody, certainly not subject to legal process, but sort of understandable and potentially even just. Then there's another form of violence, and this was the systematic violence that happened under the rule of the Committee on Public Safety. And that's where you have a centralized bureau, and then there are all these, basically these lists that are being delivered to these decision makers about who is supposed to die. And every day there are lists, and people are brought, and they are tried in the morning, and they are guillotined in the afternoon. This is the bloody period of the terror. Now, I think there's something worth thinking about here, and we can think about it with Lenin. A harsh thing we have to think about with respect to revolution. And maybe that is simply that, hey, look, revolution, especially when it becomes social and not just political, means the total upheaval of a society. It means the disempowerment of the previously powerful. Now, how are you going to disempower the previously powerful? How are you going to disempower those who have power except by violence? If you don't kill the previously wealthy, if you don't kill the previous ruling class, now that class, they still know one another, they still have money, maybe they still have some land, they definitely have connections to other nations, they have family connections, they have business connections, they have military connections. They are a threat to your revolution so long as they exist. So the destruction of tens of thousands of people may be an unfortunate necessity of a real revolution. Same thing happens under the Bolsheviks during the course of the Civil War, 1918 to 1922, and shortly afterwards, under the rule of Lenin. A couple 100,000 people are killed. And this is unjust in a legal sense, because there's no legal proceeding going on, but it's actually not possible for revolutionary violence to be legally justified, because revolutions really mean the upheaval of the legal as well as the ownership system. To give you a foreshadowing of Marx, the legal system typically follows from and reinforces the social economic system. So, of course, in a feudal system, there's laws which enserf certain people. In Jim Crow, there are laws that affect the black population in the South to the benefit of the white population in the South. And that means that any truly revolutionary action is also going to be illegal action. So it might just be the case that in revolutions people get killed, and let's not try to romanticize this stuff. Anyway, so Robespierre is known for being a proponent of the terror. He's on the one hand, he's understood as this truly pure and principled individual who cares about empowerment of the disempowered. He cares about these principles that Rousseau had laid out about the equality of human beings, the freedom of individuals. And he was, like Rousseau, completely irate about a system, this old system, which systematically removes or inhibits those values and those rights. So on the one hand, Robespierre is a Puritan. He's a purely minded, principled person. Thus, Robespierre the incorruptible. But on the other hand, in a certain way, he probably does get corrupted, because the moment that he gets into power, he starts acting to reinforce that power. This is exactly what happened in the Russian Revolution, by the way. Like the story that we're often told about the Russian Revolution is that the Bolshevik Party did it. That Lenin and Trotsky and people in this group conspired, planned, strategized, and then carried out an uprising which eventually was successful, deposed feudalism in Russia, got rid of Tsar Nicholas, and all that. There was some of that planning, but I think what really happened was that there were spontaneous uprisings all across Russia, which is huge, in which local confederations of people took over their own territories. The land on which they had been enserfed became land which they now controlled. And probably the majority of those groups were anarchist in fashion rather than centralized state communist. But then the Bolsheviks did exactly what the Jacobins did. They systematically infiltrated every one of these Soviets. In the Soviet case, they're called Soviets. Soviet just means like a commune. They infiltrated them, and they forced and they leveraged and they tricked and they beat people into integrating their Soviet into the central organizing direction of the Bolsheviks in Moscow. Same thing happens in France. The Jacobins centralize France. They take over these grassroots bases of power, and they decentralized bases of power, and they centralize them. And in this process, Robespierre really changes his tune about what's good for France. Previously, it had been kind of loose, pluralistic, democratic, direct democratic control. And the moment that he becomes the center, then he starts to believe that everybody needs to be organized around that center. So he empowers himself and he empowers the Jacobins. And what happens to him eventually? The same thing that happens to just about everybody on the Committee for Public Safety, just about everybody who played a central role in this most turbulent portion of the French Revolution. He also dies by the guillotine. Okay, so that's an introduction to him. Now, the reading that we have from him hits on a few things, but two in particular. So I don't know actually if you're going to be able to read this very well, but you know, if it totally fails and you can't read it, know that these are the notes. They're called Robespierre notes, or notes on Robespierre, that are on. So if you can't read it in this video, still you can get those notes out and you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. So I gave you several different speeches that were given by Robespierre in the period of his ascendancy during the French Revolution. Some of these are real basic that I just want you to know, what he thought. And then there's a couple that I think are really worth thinking about in detail because of their close connection to our circumstance, and because, in particular, with respect to Robespierre's wish to limit free trade, because that position is clearly in line with the whole development of socialist theory. So, general positions of Robespierre. He was anti-slavery. That's an interesting position, or rather, the question of slavery is an interesting one in France because, as I said, the French Revolution is renowned for changing the face of Europe, for introducing freedom and progress and democracy into the course of history. The French Revolution was a massive earthquake which shook everything, and Europe was never the same. Arguably, history was never the same. The French Revolution is associated with democracy and freedom and the basis of government upon the rights of the people. So all the stuff that Rousseau wanted, the idea that legitimate government is always based on the will of the people. And without that will of the people, which is expressed by a vote, you have only tyranny. All this stuff is associated with the French Revolution. It's supposed to be about democracy, etc. And yet there's this weird fact that, and C.L.R. James is going to point this out next week, this weird fact that a good portion, 20-30% maybe, of the people who are involved in those initial assemblies oriented towards the construction of a new constitution were themselves wealthy on the basis of the slave trade. So there was this drive to constitutionally legalize slavery, particularly because of the island that they now refer to as Saint-Domingue. That's the island that had been Hispaniola at this point in history. The western half of that island is controlled by the French. Haiti, which they're calling Saint-Domingue, becomes Haiti after the Haitian Revolution. And that colony is the most lucrative colony in the world. It's generating sugar, other things too, indigo and coffee, but primarily sugar. And the sugar trade, as well as the slave trade, had totally altered the economy and even the infrastructure of France itself. So big shipbuilding companies were wealthy because the slave trade existed, because they produced the vehicles for that trade. And then, especially the southern coast and the western coast, the places in France where there were ports, their infrastructure was radically altered as they built a whole bunch of sugar refineries to deal with the raw product that was coming from the colonies. There was a proprietary relationship between the mother colonial country, France, and the colony, which had to send its products to France. So all those people who had been involved in like shipbuilding or in sugar refining or in sugar distribution or in straight out slaving or in other aspects of that trade, they needed slavery to continue. They needed it to continue so that their wealth could continue. So there's a real debate going on between them. And Robespierre takes the principled position here. He's like, look, either you mean that people have rights or you don't. And if people have rights, they cannot be enslaved. If you put slavery into your constitution, you will have re-established utter tyranny and domination. So he's straight principled Rousseau on this point. There's also a position that he takes about the beheading of the king, which is just, I suppose, sort of typical of him. On the one hand, and he's distinguishing between revolutionary and constitutional governments. This is something that we'll read about again with Hannah Arendt. Revolutionary government is like what Robespierre was a part of. And what that government was doing was executing all these people without, they had trials, but they're like fast military tribunals where there's very little hope that anybody is going to get anything except for their head lopped off. There's fast killing, and even sometimes there are mistaken killings of people which maybe it would be years later it would turn out that they were not really an opponent of the Jacobins or of the revolution or supporters of the aristocracy or the king, but it could come out days later. And Robespierre was aware of this, that they were killing people by accident. They didn't mean to do it, but they were doing it. And nevertheless, he thought this was legit. That's because revolutionary government is preparing the ground on which a new state can exist. And in order to do that, it's basically at war. It's at war with its enemies. And everything that happens at war, including the accidental killing of innocents, is going to happen in a revolutionary war. And on the other hand, what this revolutionary government is attempting to achieve, supposedly, is a situation where rule of law can be reestablished, eventually, at some point. And Robespierre's like, okay, so some people wanted to not kill the king. They had imprisoned him and his family. And he tried to escape at one point, which like really pissed everybody off. But some people thought like, well, okay, you have to try him for his crimes. Like you can't just, execute him. That's just straight out violence. We're trying to be a legitimate government here. And Robespierre's like, no, you're misunderstanding. Because with respect to the king, we still exist in the state of nature. We exist in a relationship of raw force with the king. He is the previous tyrant. If we start behaving legalistically with him, what we're doing is just from a military perspective, from a strategic perspective, we're just setting up the ground where like all the factions which are secretly still in support of the king and want their old system back because it benefited them, they're going to be able to muster their forces and organize themselves, and through the trial of the king, we will then produce more enemies for ourselves. We'll produce more battles that we'll have to fight. No. We have to kill the king outright, immediately. He doesn't get a trial. So this is sort of Robespierre's logic. And that difference between a revolutionary and a constitutional government is something that Arendt is going to talk about in our next reading. Okay, the two things that I think are worth looking at in more detail, though, are that Rousseau takes a particular position about the carrying out of foreign war versus revolutionary war. We'll start there. And then the second thing is he recommends a very specific limitation upon free trade, which I think we should really talk about. At this period in time, 1793 or so, 1792, 1793, France has executed its king. It has deposed its aristocracy. It has abolished its priesthood. I mean, it's gotten quite extreme, right? And it's got all these neighbors, which are still aristocracies, which are still monarchies. And so from the perspective of neighboring Austria or Prussia, who are the most serious threats at this point in time, they see France as a threat to themselves. It is an existential threat. And I think they're right to see it that way. The monarchies in those places were totally imperiled by the existence of this like out of control, massive leveling process that was happening in France. So they're gathering their armies, and they look like a real threat. And there's a debate within the leadership of the French Revolution about whether they should go ahead and go to war, just straight out attack Austria and Prussia. And Rousseau is against that. Now, they end up having to fight these people anyway because they do get attacked, and that's fine. But what Robespierre is saying is like, no, we got to focus on the revolution here. Revolutionary war is fine. Fighting the enemies of the people is fine. Like running down the last of the aristocrats is fine. It's necessary. Setting up new systems of government here is necessary. But if we get involved fighting a war against the Austrians or the Prussians, and eventually under Napoleon, France would go to war with the entirety of Europe, finally being defeated in Russia, just like the Nazis were. If we do that, it's going to have negative impact upon our democracy at home. And this, of course, is why I think this is a point that is worth bringing into connection with us. Here are the arguments that Robespierre makes against foreign war. He says, okay, when you have your nation at war with another nation over here, that distracts public opinion. It draws public interest away from, for example, the building of democracy, the building of new institutions, the renovation of the education system, the careful evaluation of previous corruption and routing out of corruption, the keeping an eye on like rising factions which may want to reverse the democratic course of the revolution. You have to be very attentive to your revolutionary circumstance, but if you've got a foreign war, then everybody looks at that instead. The anxieties that people may have had about what was happening in their own situation, and they needed to be active in order to prevent a new elite from arising and dominating them. Instead, if they're worried about that war, they stop thinking about stuff over here. It takes attention away from internal domestic problems, corruption, potential coups. Having constant foreign war lulls people to sleep. Now, here are structural changes that happen when you have permanent war or like ongoing external war. Generals, military commanders, weapons salesmen end up being really benefited, and they get more power than they had before. The weapons salesmen get more influence within the government. Of course, they get more money. The generals and military officials who in peacetime are kind of unnecessary, now they get to make much greater decisions about how the general public wealth is spent. What happens to the general public itself, who become inscripted and are then subject to totally non-democratic relationships in the hierarchical military command structure. When this war is going on, it allows government to hide everything under a veil of secrecy and to shut up whistleblowers. You see how this is connected to the present, I imagine. It allows training of soldiers so that they could be trained to kill fellow citizens. This is a big deal. One of the pivotal moments, the point at which eventually the king and his family are taken prisoner and put in, they had been in Versailles and they were moved to the Tuileries in Paris. That was possible because good portions of the French military had turned their guns from defending the king and pointing at the population to defending the population and pointing at the king. Well, if you get a large-scale foreign war going on, now you can separate these troops out from the general population again. I mean, that happened because there was intermingling between the soldiers and the people, because their families were right there, because people they knew were right there, because they came to identify themselves as citizens and poor people instead of as supporters of the king, instead of nationalists, I suppose. But when you take soldiers away from the general population and you put them in barracks and you put them in training facilities and then you ship them overseas, you're in this radically powerful position with respect to their ideology and their behavior, and you can train them up to believe that all these people who are agitating for democratic power back in the home country are a bunch of radicals and rebels and crazies, and they need to be killed. So the military becomes a big problem for the democratic public. The generals end up with the power of life and death over their own soldiers, but also like if they're on the borders with the nations that they're fighting, in the territories that are controlled militarily, they have power of life and death over everybody. They become the police. So the problem with foreign war is all these things. And of course, you can bring this over to conjunction with us. What are the effects of our constant foreign wars upon internal rights? So who are we at war now? At war with now? We're in Afghanistan. We're in Iraq. We're in Syria. Special forces are in every country in Africa. You may not have known that, but it's true. We are in Yemen, we are in Somalia, we are acting together with the Saudis, we are in Iran, special forces. Anyway, we know that we have this so-called war on terror, right? So just say, let's say the war on terror, because we have the war on terror. And before that, we had the war on drugs, and we had the war on Saddam Hussein, and we had the war in Central America, and we had one thing after another. We had the war in Vietnam, and we had the war in Korea, and we had the Second World War, and we had the First World War, and we had the American invasion of the Philippines. There was always something. Doesn't this always something, always some war, always some foreign enemy? The whole Cold War, right? Like, so much stuff is justified because we have to worry about communism. You know, like communism is taking over everything, and therefore we have to sacrifice certain freedoms, blah, 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 because of the grandness of this threat. Isn't it the case that there being a foreign war, there being a grand arch enemy in the distance, let's watch out for Vladimir Putin, or let's watch out for Iran, or let's watch out for North Korea, as if these places were any kind of real threat to us. But doesn't having them as enemies out there facilitate the government doing all kinds of anti-democratic things at home? Does constant war, for example, raise defense contractors and produce this homeland security bubble, giving these institutions greater influence than they ought to? Doesn't it promote political corruption? And doesn't it hide everything that the government does under a veil of secrecy? Of course, we know this is going on a profound degree, right? So, Edward Snowden is a well-known person because he was able to reveal that the government is spying on every damn thing we do. So every time you send a text, every time you talk on your phone, all that stuff is compiled in databases, probably in, Utah, by the NSA, and then it's scanned by algorithms looking for certain word choices. It's put into, networking, modeling applications in order to see who knows who, and the more you are connected, and the more closely you are connected to persons of interest, the more of their shit, of your shit, they're going to look at. Isn't this all because of this veil of constant war, constant threat? And therefore, wouldn't a good revolutionary thing be to back off foreign war for the sake of being able to look at our own democracy or lack of democracy? Okay, so those are the questions there, and I hope that you will discuss about. Now, there's one second argument that he makes that I want to present, and then turn that into questions, and we'll be done with Robespierre. Robespierre was operating from a governmental perspective in a situation where not all of the land had been nationalized. This wasn't the kind of Bolshevik style revolution where they're taking central control over all production everywhere. But he sort of wants to move in that direction, and there's a reason. The land had not all been taken away from the wealthy people who ran it. Hypothetically, many of the aristocrats had been deposed, but people like the farmer general, who were not nobles, and so who were not totally enfranchised by the previous system, and who could well express a solidarity with the revolutionaries because they too wanted to change the system, not ultimately to put the poor in power, but to put themselves in power. But they could be nominally and even really pro-revolution, but they still owned big chunks of land. Now, there was starvation in France in 1792, 1793. But it wasn't because there was underproduction of grain. In fact, there was surplus production of grain. The famine resulted from the fact that the growers of the grain were not making it available to the French population. They were doing one of two other things. They were either holding on to the grain, just stockpiling it, until demand rose enough to drive up the value of the grain so that they would make more money from it. And in that case, only those portions of the population that had enough money to afford it would get it. And so the poorest would still be left hungry. Or they were selling this grain on foreign markets. So they're selling it even to the entities which very quickly would become the military enemies of France. Selling to the Germans, selling to the Austrians, selling to the English. They're selling wherever the price was the best. Now here's Robespierre making an argument that I think leads to basically socialism. And here is a way that you can understand socialism, what it is. And I just want to transform this ultimately into a question. Like, don't you think this might be true? So what Robespierre says is, like, well, first of all, there is this ongoing tendency, which we see all the time too, to identify freedom, the right to freedom, the freeness of individuals, with free trade. with freedom of commerce, with freedom of capitalists to do whatever they want. We tend to identify all of these things. But what Robespierre is suggesting, and what socialists will always say, is that actually the real freedom of individuals, their ability to be equal to one another, to determine their own fate, to develop their potentialities, is diametrically opposed to free trade, which inhibits all of these things. So capitalist-minded people like to identify free trade and individual freedom. Socialist-minded people understand that freedom and free trade are opposed to one another. And Robespierre is on this side. So what he said, he starts this off with an argument of principle. Now remember, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, they based themselves, at least rhetorically, but not just rhetorically, legalistically, even strategically to some extent. They based themselves upon ideas about natural human rights, civil rights. And so if you look at the Declaration of Independence, or if you look at the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, which Lafayette wrote while speaking with Thomas Jefferson, and he basically ripped off just parts of the Declaration of Independence, they both start, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are born with certain rights, including, first of all, the right to life, liberty, and X. And the Declaration becomes the pursuit of happiness, but Jefferson had a bunch of drafts where it was the pursuit of property, which tells you something about class and business and all that. And Lafayette chose that option. But the first one is life, the right to life. And here is Robespierre's, I think, quite pragmatic, quite compelling argument. He's like, okay, there's two options here. Either, option number one, I have a so-called right to life, but that's just words. It's total bullshit. It's something we like to say, but it has no further meaning than that. It's like, okay, well, if that's your right to life, screw your right to life. We have no interest in rights that are not real rights. Or, if it's a real right, and I really do have, and you really do have, a right to life, this must mean that I also have, and you also have, a right to the means of life. A right to the means of life. Meaning, I'm an organic life form. I'm not, pure soul or digital. I need food. I need health care. I need shelter. I need clothing. And probably in order to operate in a democracy, in order to prevent a ruling class from again ascending and inhibiting all these needs of mine, inhibiting my capacity to develop myself as a free being, I also need education. So he talks specifically about food, but his argument extends to all these things. And that idea that before profit making can happen, the needs, the basic needs of the population have to be satisfied. You have to produce and you have to use the products of land and labor in order to satisfy the needs of the population before you can make profit. That is a proto-socialist position. If you wanted to really, there's probably a couple ways you could do this, but if you want to really understand what socialism is about, it's about that. Using the resources and labor of a population, first of all, to sustain and make healthy and make capable that population. In Robespierre's case, he's willing to allow a sort of hybridity where we're going to have this socialist base, but then it'll be okay for people to go ahead and make profit. So the way this operates specifically with regard to grain production, which is what he's talking about, is that he wants to governmentally limit what grain producers can do to follow these prescriptions. So this means that those producers who are really just employing labor, I mean, they don't produce it themselves. They control the land. They control the resource, and on that basis, they're able to control the labor. They're going to be caused, legally required, with inspectors and everything, to make sure to produce enough grain for, say, the people in their immediate vicinity. Maybe divide up France, and like whoever's the closest producer is going to have to take care of the people in need in their vicinity. Now, it's not that they have to do this charitably. Rousseau's like, we're going to cover the costs of the labor. We're going to cover the cost of the seed stock. We're going to cover the cost of the transportation or whatever. It's not like the landowner is going to lose money on this, but he's not going to make a profit either. Because before he has the right to a profit, he has an obligation to prevent suffering in his fellow citizens. And you see the problem here. The problem is that the landowner and everybody else are economically in two different positions. This one's powerful, these are not. This one has, these do not. But politically, they're supposed to be on the same level as fellow citizens making decisions together. So what socialism does is it insists that, like, political equality, nominally having the same rights to a vote on paper, is insufficient for real equality, because you gotta correct economic inequality too. And the baseline way in which to correct this economic inequality is, first of all, to make sure that the bottom for everybody is sustainable, that you're not going to lapse into starvation, you're not going to lapse into homelessness. First, you got to prevent that. And then, supposedly, once the neighbors are taken care of, then the farmer general has the right to go ahead and sell the surplus on the market. And Robespierre says other things too. He's like, okay, and if you're selling, like, super fancy, like, I don't know, caviar, go to it. Make a profit, no problem, because everybody can live without caviar. Caviar is nice. I like caviar, but I can live without it. Luxury goods they can be messed with in a capitalist fashion. You can invest in their production, try and sell them so that you get more back than you put into it, so that you get richer, can generate wealth. That's fine. Do that with the luxury market. But you should not, and Robespierre's like, look, food is not a commodity. It shouldn't be a commodity in the same way that caviar is a commodity. Bread, which is the typical placeholder for, like, subsistence food, does not have the same character, does not have the same relationship to human life as caviar does. So when it comes to these basic requirements, and here again I would extend it and say, we should probably have to be talking about food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, education. All these things are not just commodities on a market. They're the needs of life, and they're the things that people, because they have a right to life, deserve, first of all. Now, this is something really different from our situation, right? Because clearly all of those things are commodities today. I mean, clean water is a commodity today. And this means that we have a situation which is not acceptable from Robespierre's perspective. Okay, so just to translate all this stuff into questions. Do you agree with this? Do people have a right to food, water, housing, medical care, and education? And if you think that they do you think that that right is satisfied under our system? Do you think that things that are necessary for life should be freely traded, that means traded for profit, on the market? Or would you agree with Robespierre that that's a bad idea? Do you agree with Robespierre that so-called free trade actually inhibits the circulation of needed things in the poor domestic population? Because remember, there was grain enough. And this happens for real in the world today. I mean, massive famines in Ethiopia, for example, have occurred when there was surplus grain production happening there. But that surplus grain production was overseen by corporate agribusiness, multinationals, who were raising monocropped food in Ethiopia for export. Like the contemporary neoliberal system is organized such that independent nations, well, they're not really independent anymore. They're caused to raise specialty products that differentiate them from the rest of the world. But that means that they're not raising everything they need for their own population, and then to sell things on the international market. So it can well happen that surplus is produced in a particular place, but that right around that place, there can still be a deficit. So do you agree with him and with what I'm saying that free trade can actually inhibit the free circulation of food? Because, Robespierre wants to retask that term, freedom or free trade, and be like, no. Free circulation is what happens when people who really need food are capable of getting food. And here's the sort of sharp point of this question. Do you agree that property rights should be limited exactly where they adversely affect others or inhibit the fulfillment of their rights? Do you think that there ought to be limitations on property rights? I mean, in large part, we are a part of a system now that puts property rights above everything else. Should we change that? Does it bother you that there are food surpluses in the very countries where starvation occurs? Okay, so that's what's up with Robespierre. These are the sorts of things I want to look at in him.